RC here, and today we will be dealing with a passage courtesy of Godless Engineer, who contributed to letting us deal with a text of Scripture. Numbers chapter 31, verse 7 through 18 is what we are dealing with today, and it's about time to bury this attempted eisegesis of Scripture. Now, here we go! So we need to read carefully and examine each verse in its respectful context. By reading the entire set of passages, we get this by the plain reading. The Israelites went to war with the Midianites, and they won the fight. They proceeded to kill every male, took their spoils and women, burned down their cities, and eventually killed the women as they left the virgins alive for sex slavery. So far, this can lead to come to the conclusion of the Israelites stealing women and committing genocide. Let's examine each part carefully, since that is what we must do when looking at an ancient text like the Bible. When dealing with verses 7 through 8, we can go ahead and say that the kings were killed, but not every single man was. If we actually go to examine these, the verses show a sign of hyperbolic war language, which is utilized in other ancient Near Eastern accounts. Examples of this include the following, which is given by both Paul Copan and Kenneth Kitchens in their books on the Old Testament. However, here's a clip from Paul Copan's lecture on this matter, where he names a few of these examples.
So let's unpack this a little bit. Let's take a look at the ancient Near East briefly. King Tutmosis III. He states that the numerous army of Mitanni was overthrown within an hour, annihilated totally and so forth, and is non-existent. Well, the historical fact was that the forces of Mitanni lived to fight beyond this into the 15th and 14th centuries, well beyond what Tutmosis III had claimed. Here's another example, the Bulletin of Ramses II on Egypt's considerably less than decisive victory at Kadesh in Syria. In 1274-1273. Look at the language here. Sound familiar? Millions of foreigners that he took no note of, that he regarded them as chaff. He slew the entire force, as well as all the chiefs of all the countries that had come with him. That his majesty slaughtered and slew them in their places, and his majesty was alone, none other with him. So, no, he was the only one standing. Everyone else wiped out. Remember, this was not a decisive victory. This was something that was quite, almost like a stalemate. But yet here he's using this kind of sweeping language. King Mesha of Moab said, Israel has utterly perished for always, but the historical fact was this is premature by 100 years, when Assyria would actually destroy Israel, and that would actually, a lot of Israelites would survive what would become a mixed group.
So the war language used is simply referring to a complete victory in battle or conquest, but not a literal annihilation, especially when later on in Judges chapter 6, verse 1, we read of the Midianites being still around. This is what we get when we read all the accounts of war texts in the ancient Near East at the same time and utilize that in our study of the entirety of the Bible. Next, we deal with the next set of verses, which deal with the idea of women being captured and being killed. First thing to consider is that this is not some random attack. It's actually revenge in light of what previously occurred to the Israelites by the Midianites. If we read in chapter 25, we might find our answer. The verses at first indicate that the Moabites, except of course in verse 6, mention an Israelite bringing in a Midianite woman. At first this seems innocent just looking at the verse. Why kill the man, however, in verse 8 along with the woman? Based on what we keep reading, verse 15 says, and the name of the Midianitish woman that was slain was Cosbi, the daughter of Zur, who was a head over a people, and of a chief house in Midian. So the woman was in a tribal head of a family in Midian. We keep reading. They announced their plan for war. Verse 18. We keep reading that they announced their plan for war. Verse 18 explains why by saying, for they vex you with their wiles, wherewith they have beguiled you in the matter of Peor, and in the matter of Cosbi, the daughter of a prince of Midian, their sister, which was slain in the day of the plague for Peor's sake. So a plague occurred because of this, a plague that verse 9 says claimed over the lives of 24,000 people. as well as to entice people to sin and rebellion. Numbers chapter 31 verse 16 even states this by saying, quote, "Behold, these caused the children of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to commit trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor. And there was a plague among the congregation of the Lord. Balaam was a prophet who worshipped all the gods of his land. And though in Numbers chapter 22 to 24, he refuses to curse Israel as the Midianites pleaded, it seems he at least offered some advice on how to go against Israel. And that's what happens in Numbers 25. Old Testament scholar John Walton reveals the background in pages 48 to 49 of his book of the Israelite conquests. Quote, "The Midianites deceived Israel," Numbers chapter 25 verse 18, following the advice of Balaam, Numbers chapter 31 verse 16. This is in contrast to something the Israelites received passively. Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, Numbers chapter 25 verse 3. Idols became, and says idols, goes on to say, became a snare, and then cites Psalm 106 verse 36. What exactly the Midianite scheme was, or what it was supposed to achieve, is lost to us. In any case, the description treated you as enemies when they deceived you, Numbers chapter 25 verse 18, indicates that it was not that friendly in intention. One possibility is that they have discovered a workaround to Balaam's inability to curse Israel. The presence of Balaam among the Midianites when he is killed in Numbers 31 verse 8 indicates that he came back at some point after returning to his home in Numbers chapter 24 verse 25, presumably to offer the advice mentioned in Numbers chapter 31 verse 16. Finally, we deal with verse 18, which says, "But all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourself." So what does this mean? Most translations say young females or girls. The Hebrew words used are taf and ishta, which mean child and female. The combination of these words in the form of hat taf ban nasim in the Hebrew text indicates that this is a child or young person whose gender is feminine. Vine's dictionary defines this particular usage as, quote, "The word means children." So these young women are being taken for two reasons. The first reason is to remove them from the presence of a pagan nation and have them become members of a holy nation under the rule of the true sovereign Lord. Secondly, it was to help build back the lost numbers due to the 24,000 who died from the plague due to Moab and Midian. Some may claim that the purpose was sex slavery, but that is not found anywhere in the text.
In verse 18, those who had not had sexual intercourse with a man. Now, that the questions that the atheist guy, gave our questioner, about sex slavery, that there's no sex slavery in this passage. If you were a virgin, you were marriable. And if you were married by an Israelite man, then you became a member of the Israelite camp, which means you were entitled to the rights and the protections of the Israelite society. I mean, it doesn't necessitate a select save like sex trafficking situation. So that's an assumption.
So with this context in mind, what can we ultimately say about this? Well, the fact is that the Moabites, Midianites conspired with Balaam to get Israel to be cursed, destroyed. As a result of this, 24,000 people died from their act. They retaliated with war as revenge, as well as capturing the young women to free them from the pagan culture. As barbaric as this may sound, this doesn't mean that this approach was seen as universally moral or good itself to God.
I mean, it's obviously harsh, but I would take this back, that when you see these familiar practices, when you see these cultural practices, especially if they are associated with idolatry specifically, I think on the one hand, here we are with the Moabites here. On the one hand, you could say, and there is some logic to the fact that, well, this is what we do in conquest in our patriarchal Semitic culture. This is how we do things. And there are lots of other things, again, that are familiar to and related to, really part of that world, the world of the biblical person, the world of the biblical writer at the time. And they just sort of, on one level, are what they are. In other words, God doesn't come to Moses or any other biblical author and say, hey, I'd love to use you to write something down, but you need to change your culture first. You need to rid your culture of this particular element that is offensive, or someone living later might consider offensive, or the Gentiles, who are going to read this stuff later might consider offensive, or whatever. You need to change your culture first, and then we can work together. Okay, God never does that. And a lot of this stuff that winds up in Scripture, especially in legislation, okay, especially legal kind of things, and again, this is part of it. You have legality, you have conquest, you have warfare, again, the rules of war and all that sort of stuff. That, again, on one level, that just sort of is what it is. And God doesn't say, hey, nobody else does this, but we're going to institute this thing where we go into a city and then you get to kill people. I mean, it's not foreign at all.
That being said, the objection that this is referring to the extermination of an entire race of people is not sound based on the ancient Near Eastern context of the area as well as the language. Plus, as to why the young women were taken was not because of sex slavery, but for the purpose of saving the girls from a pagan culture and helping restore the fallen numbers of Israel. Nothing more, nothing less. This has been RC Apologist. Take care.